The steakhouse on North Michigan Avenue smelled like garlic butter and expensive cologne, and Emma Carter had learned to move through it like she belonged, even on nights when she didn't feel like she did. She'd been a waitress there for 3 years, and in that time she'd memorized every squeaky floorboard, every regular's order, every way the kitchen could go sideways on a Friday. What she hadn't gotten used to was the way some of her coworkers looked at her when they thought she wasn't paying attention. Emma was 28, plus size, with dark hair she kept twisted up during shifts, and a laugh that came easy, even on hard days. She worked harder than almost anyone on the floor. She remembered names, she never dropped a ticket, and she'd covered more shifts than she could count for people who wouldn't have done the same for her.
None of that seemed to matter to Priya and Jessica, 2 servers who'd worked there almost as long as she had, and never missed a chance to make a comment about her size dressed up as a joke. That Friday started like any other. The restaurant was packed, the kind of night where every table turned twice and the hostess stand had a line out the door. Around 7, Priya waved Emma over with an expression that should have been a warning sign. "You caught a good one tonight," Priya said, barely hiding her smile. "VIP wants the private room, specifically asked for you." "Me?" Emma glanced toward the back hallway. "Why me?" "Said he likes friendly servers." Jessica appeared beside Priya, arms crossed, eyes glittering with something Emma couldn't quite place. "Guess you're his type." Emma should have caught the tone. Looking back later, she'd realized she had caught it, somewhere underneath the nerves, and chosen to ignore it because she didn't have time to unpack workplace pettiness in the middle of a dinner rush. She smoothed her apron, grabbed a fresh notepad, and walked toward the private dining room at the end of the hall. The door was heavy oak, the kind that muffled sound completely. Emma knocked once and pushed it open. The room went quiet the second she stepped inside. 4 men sat around the table, all in dark tailored suits that looked like they cost more than Emma made in a year. But it was the man at the head of the table who made her stomach drop. He was younger than she expected, maybe late 20s, with sharp features and the kind of stillness that filled the room without him having to say anything. Everything about him, from his posture to the way the other men deferred to him without being asked, told her exactly what kind of power was sitting in front of her. She didn't know his name yet, but she knew his type. Chicago had plenty of men like this, men whose reputations arrived in a room before they did. "I'm Emma," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll be taking care of you tonight." For a moment, nobody spoke. One of the men near the end of the table smirked, and Emma felt her face go hot, certain this was the beginning of exactly the kind of night her coworkers had set her up for. She'd been in this position before, one way or another, standing in front of people who looked at her and decided she was something to laugh at before she'd even opened her mouth. Then the man at the head of the table looked up. His eyes moved over her once, not the way she braced for, but like he was actually seeing her. He gestured toward the chair closest to him, though he didn't sit down himself. "Thank you for coming in," he said. His voice was low, even, unbothered. "I'm Nathan. These are my associates. We won't keep you longer than you need." It wasn't what Emma expected. There was no smirk in his tone, no hidden edge. He spoke to her the way he might speak to anyone he respected, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd been rude. Nathan Brooks watched Emma's hands as she set down water glasses, noticing the slight tremor she was trying to hide, the careful way she kept her eyes on her notepad instead of the men around the table. He'd been in enough rooms to read discomfort instantly, and this wasn't ordinary nerves. Something about the whole setup felt arranged, staged in a way that had nothing to do with Emma and everything to do with whoever had sent her in here. "Take your time with the menu," he said before she could ask for their order. "There's no rush tonight." The other men exchanged a glance, clearly expecting him to play along with whatever they assumed the evening was supposed to be. Instead, Nathan asked Emma what she'd recommend, listened when she answered, and thanked her by name when she brought their drinks. He asked about the kitchen's specials instead of ignoring her the way half his guests usually did with waitstaff.
Slowly, the tightness in Emma's shoulders started to ease. By the time she left to put in their order, something in the room had shifted, though Emma couldn't have named what. She only knew that whatever her co-workers had been hoping for hadn't happened. Instead of feeling smaller, she felt, for the first time in the entire painfully long night, like someone had actually looked at her and decided she was worth being decent to. Out in the hallway, Priya and Jessica were waiting, eager for details, already exchanging looks that told Emma they expected a disaster story. Emma just shook her head and walked past them toward the kitchen, unsure yet what exactly had just happened, but certain it wasn't what anyone out here had planned.
Back in the private room, Nathan sat in silence for a moment after the door clicked shut behind her. One of his men finally spoke. "You know that was a setup, right?" Nathan didn't answer right away. He was still looking at the door. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." By the following Tuesday, Emma had almost convinced herself that Friday night had been a strange, isolated moment, the kind of thing that happens once and never again. Then the hostess called her name during the early dinner shift, and Emma looked up to see Nathan Brooks walking through the front doors, alone, dressed down slightly from the suit she'd seen him in before, but still unmistakably him. "He's asking for your section," the hostess said, sounding a little confused since Nathan hadn't reserved the private room this time. He'd simply walked in and requested a normal table. Emma led him to a two-top near the window, aware of Priya watching from across the room, with an expression Emma couldn't quite read. Nathan sat down, glanced at the menu out of politeness more than need, and ordered the same thing he'd had the week before. "You remembered," Emma said, surprised despite herself. "I remember most things," Nathan said simply. Over the next hour, Emma found herself talking to him more than she talked to most regulars, though their conversations stayed easy and unremarkable in the best way. He asked about her shift, whether the kitchen was backed up, how long she'd worked there. She asked what someone like him did during the day, immediately regretting the vague phrasing, but Nathan only smiled slightly. "I run a few hotels," he said. "Legitimate ones. People assume the rest." Emma didn't push further, and Nathan didn't offer more than that, but something about his directness put her at ease. He wasn't performing charm the way some customers did, the type who complimented her just to see if she'd blush. He simply talked to her like a person, which by itself felt unusual enough to notice. He came back Thursday, then again the following Monday. Each visit followed the same quiet rhythm: food, easy conversation, no pressure, no games. Emma began to recognize the sound of the front door and somehow know it was him before she even turned around. She told herself it was just good customer service instinct. She wasn't entirely convinced. Meanwhile, the rest of the staff couldn't stop talking about it. "This was supposed to embarrass her," Jessica muttered to Priya one afternoon, loud enough that Emma caught the tail end while walking past the service station. "How is she suddenly his favorite waitress?" Priya didn't answer, mostly because she didn't have one. Their plan had been simple: send Emma into a room with someone powerful and intimidating, assume he'd be rude or dismissive, and enjoy watching her flustered reaction afterward. Instead, the powerful man kept coming back, specifically for her, and the story circulating through the restaurant had flipped completely from what they intended. By the second week, whispers had turned into something bigger. One of the line cooks joked that Emma had a rich boyfriend now. A server from the day shift asked if it was true that Nathan Brooks had bought out the private room 3 times just to see her. None of it was accurate, but restaurants ran on gossip the way kitchens ran on ticket times, fast and constant, and Emma found herself the center of a story she hadn't asked to be part of. She tried to shrug it off, but it wore on her more than she let on. She wasn't used to being talked about, not like this. She was used to being overlooked, which had its own kind of sting, but this new attention felt different, heavier somehow, like she was being watched to see if she'd fail. Nathan noticed the shift in her mood before she said anything about it. It was a Thursday evening, the restaurant quieter than usual, when he asked her directly. "You've seemed tense the last few visits," he said, stirring his coffee without really drinking it. "Everything all right?" Emma hesitated, unsure how much to say to a man she barely knew, no matter how many conversations they'd had.
but something about his steady patience made her want to be honest. "People talk," she admitted, "about why you keep coming in. About us, I guess, even though there's no us. It's just uncomfortable." Nathan set his cup down and looked at her for a long moment. "People will always find something to talk about," he said. "Doesn't mean it deserves your energy." "Easy for you to say," Emma replied, a little sharper than she intended. "You're not the one everyone's staring at like you don't belong here." She expected him to get defensive, or maybe just change the subject the way most people did when a conversation got uncomfortable. Instead, Nathan nodded slowly, like he was actually considering what she'd said. "You're right," he said. "I'm not the one they're staring at. But for what it's worth, I've dealt with plenty of people who thought they had the right to comment on my life. Eventually, they get bored and move on to someone else's business. It just takes time." Emma appreciated the honesty more than she expected to. There was no attempt to fix her feelings or brush past them, just a quiet acknowledgement that she was dealing with something real. It was such a small moment, but it stuck with her longer than she thought it would. What she didn't know yet was that Nathan had already started paying closer attention to the dynamics around her, the way certain co-workers watched her with something closer to resentment than curiosity, the way she braced herself slightly whenever Priya or Jessica walked by. He hadn't said anything, hadn't confronted anyone, but he'd started putting pieces together in a way Emma hadn't noticed. By the end of that week, the rumors outside the restaurant had grown loud enough that even people who'd never met Emma had opinions about her. She didn't know it yet, but the attention was about to get a lot harder to ignore, and it wouldn't stay confined to the restaurant much longer. The photo appeared on a local Chicago food page before Emma even knew it existed. Someone had snapped it from 2 tables away, a grainy shot of Nathan leaning slightly across the table, saying something that made Emma laugh mid-pour. Underneath it, the caption read, "Chicago's most mysterious businessman has a regular table and a favorite waitress." By the time Emma saw it, shared into a group chat by a former co-worker who thought it was funny, it already had 400 comments. She sat in the break room staring at her phone, scrolling through strangers speculating about her relationship with a man she'd known for exactly 2.5 weeks. Some comments were harmless, people guessing they were dating, joking about a real-life fairy tale. Others weren't. A few accounts had already dug up Nathan's name and thrown around words like connected and dangerous, speculating about what kind of businessman needed that many serious-looking men trailing behind him at dinner. Emma felt her stomach twist. She wasn't naive about who Nathan likely was, not entirely, but seeing it spelled out by strangers made it feel more real, more complicated than the quiet dinners and easy conversations had let her believe. The whispering inside the restaurant got worse, too. Regulars who used to barely acknowledge her now watched her table with open curiosity. One woman, waiting for the hostess to seat her, asked Emma outright if the rumors were true. Emma forced a polite smile and said she couldn't discuss other guests, which was true, but didn't make the question sting any less. Priya and Jessica had gone quiet about it around Emma directly, but she caught them talking near the service station more than once, voices dropping the moment she got close. It wasn't the mocking tone from before. If anything, it sounded almost like disbelief, like they hadn't expected the prank to spiral into something this big. Nathan came in that Friday, later than usual, and Emma could tell almost immediately that he'd seen the photo too. He didn't bring it up until she'd taken his order and the room had cleared out enough for a real conversation. "You've seen it," he said, not really a question. "Everyone's seen it," Emma said, keeping her voice low. "I've had 3 tables ask me about you tonight. A woman I've never met wanted to know if we're together." Nathan didn't look surprised or particularly bothered, which somehow made Emma more anxious rather than less. "What did you tell her?" "That it's none of her business," Emma said, which is true, but it doesn't stop people from deciding they know the story anyway. Nathan was quiet for a moment, turning his water glass slowly on the table. "I should have thought about this before I kept coming back," he admitted. "I wasn't trying to put you in a position where people started watching you like this." It wasn't the response Emma expected. She'd braced herself for him to dismiss her concerns, or worse, to enjoy the attention the way some men might. Instead, he sounded genuinely apologetic,
which caught her off guard enough that her frustration softened without her meaning it to. "I'm not asking you to stop coming in," Emma said carefully. "I just don't know how to make people stop talking." "You don't," Nathan said. "Not really. People talk until something more interesting comes along. It's happened to me my whole life. Rumors, speculation, people deciding they understand my business without knowing a single fact about it. Eventually, it gets boring for them, and they move on to someone else's life." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No," Nathan said, and for the first time that night, something like a real smile crossed his face. "It's supposed to make you feel less alone in dealing with it." Emma hadn't expected that either. The idea that a man with his reputation, his resources, his entire guarded world understood exactly what it felt like to have strangers build a story around you that had nothing to do with the truth. It didn't erase her discomfort, but it made it easier to carry. Over the next several days, the attention outside the restaurant didn't fully die down, but it didn't escalate either. A few more photos surfaced. Nothing dramatic, just Nathan and Emma talking over dinner like they always did. The speculation online eventually shifted toward other gossip, the way trends always seem to online, moving fast and forgetting faster. What surprised Emma most was how their conversations changed after that night. Instead of walking on eggshells around the rumors, they started talking about them honestly, almost like a shared joke between two people who understood exactly how absurd the whole thing had become. Nathan told her about a headline years earlier that claimed he'd bought an entire city block just to intimidate a rival, when in reality, he'd been renovating an old warehouse for storage. Emma admitted that half her co-workers still thought she was secretly dating a movie star, based entirely on one blurry photo and someone's overactive imagination. The honesty between them became its own kind of foundation, stronger than anything built on rumors or gossip. Nathan never tried to convince her he was harmless, and Emma never pretended she didn't have questions about the world he moved through. But neither of them let speculation dictate how they treated each other, which, in a strange way, made their growing friendship feel more solid than most relationships built on fewer complications. By the time the second wave of chatter faded, Emma realized something had shifted in her own thinking too. She wasn't just tolerating Nathan's presence in her life anymore, waiting for the attention to become too much. She was starting to trust him, slowly, carefully, in a way she hadn't trusted anyone new in a long time. She didn't know yet that trust was about to be tested in an entirely different way, one that had nothing to do with strangers online and everything to do with the world Nathan actually lived in. Nathan asked her on a Tuesday, during one of her slower shifts, in the same casual tone he used to ask about the soup of the day. "Do you have Wednesday afternoon off?" Emma glanced up from refilling his water. "I do. Why?" "I want to show you something," he said. "Not a date, just somewhere I think you'd find interesting." She should have hesitated longer than she did. A month ago, the idea of spending an afternoon with a man like Nathan Brooks would have seemed impossible, or at least reckless. But the weeks of easy conversation had built something steady between them, and Emma found herself agreeing before she'd fully thought it through. The building he brought her to the next day wasn't what she expected. She'd pictured somewhere flashy, marble floors and gold fixtures meant to intimidate. Instead, the Brooks Grand on Wacker Drive had a quiet kind of elegance, warm lighting, staff who greeted Nathan with genuine familiarity rather than fear. He led her through the lobby, past the restaurant, down into a section of offices most guests never saw. "This is the part people don't think about," Nathan said, gesturing toward a wall of monitors tracking occupancy rates, staffing schedules, maintenance requests. "Everyone assumes hotels run themselves. They don't. Every detail has to work, or the whole thing falls apart." Emma watched him move through the space, and for the first time, she saw him the way his employees clearly did, not as a man to fear, but as someone who noticed everything and expected excellence without needing to raise his voice to get it. He introduced her to the general manager, a woman named Diane, who'd worked with Nathan for nearly a decade, and Emma caught the easy respect between them, nothing performative about it. "He's tough," Diane admitted later, when Nathan had stepped away to handle a phone call. "But fair. He remembers every employee's name. Doesn't matter if you're the concierge or the person cleaning rooms."
That surprised Emma more than anything else about the visit. She'd expected intimidation, distance, the kind of cold authority she associated with powerful men who ran empires from behind closed doors. Instead, she was seeing discipline built on loyalty, the same qualities she valued in her own work, just on a much larger scale. When Nathan returned, he led her to a quiet corner of the hotel restaurant, not open yet for the dinner crowd, and ordered coffee for them both. "So," he said, settling into the chair across from her, "what do you actually want to do? Not what you're doing now. What you want." Emma turned her cup slowly, unsure how honest to be.
She'd learned to keep that particular dream folded away, mostly because saying it out loud made the distance between her current life and the life she wanted feel painfully obvious.
"I want to manage a restaurant someday," she admitted finally. "Not just wait tables forever. I want to run the floor, train staff, fix the things that go wrong before they turn into disasters. I've watched enough bad management to know exactly what I wouldn't do."
She expected him to nod politely and move on, the way people often did when she mentioned ambitions that seemed far away from her current reality. Instead, Nathan leaned forward slightly, genuinely interested.
"What's stopping you?"
"Experience, mostly. Nobody hands a management position to a waitress, no matter how long she's worked the floor. You need the right resume, the right connections. I don't have either." "Experience is built," Nathan said, "not given. You already understand service better than half the managers I've fired over the years. What you're missing isn't ability, it's opportunity." Emma felt something shift in her chest, a small, cautious flicker of hope she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. "That's easy for you to say. You create your own opportunities." "I do," Nathan agreed, "but that doesn't mean you can't create yours too. You just need someone willing to give you the chance to prove it, and the discipline to actually take it once it's offered." He didn't offer her a job on the spot, and Emma appreciated that more than she expected to. If he had, she would have wondered forever whether she'd earned it or simply been handed it because of who she knew.
Instead, he spent the next half hour asking real questions. How she'd handle a difficult shift, what she'd change about the restaurant she worked at now, how she'd train a new server who kept making the same mistakes. Emma answered honestly, sometimes admitting she wasn't sure, other times surprising herself with how clearly she could picture solutions to problems she'd never been allowed to fix. Nathan listened the way he seemed to listen to everyone, fully present, without interrupting, occasionally asking a follow-up question that pushed her to think a little deeper. "You've thought about this a lot," he said eventually. "Every day I clock in," Emma admitted. "I just never thought anyone would take it seriously." "I take it seriously," Nathan said simply. They stayed another hour, the conversation drifting from restaurant management to smaller things. His early years learning the hotel business from the ground up, her first disastrous serving job at 16, where she'd spilled an entire tray of drinks on a wedding party. By the time Nathan walked her out, the sun had started to dip behind the skyline, and Emma realized she'd spent an entire afternoon without once thinking about the rumors, the co-workers, or the strange circumstances that had brought them together in the first place. For the first time since that awkward night in the private dining room, Emma didn't feel like she was being watched or judged. She felt like someone had actually looked at her potential and taken it seriously, and that feeling stayed with her long after she got home. She didn't know it yet, but that quiet afternoon in a hotel office was about to matter more than she could have imagined, especially once her co-workers decided to test her in a way that had nothing to do with kindness. The following Saturday brought the kind of reservation every server dreaded, a party of 22 celebrating a retirement, booked weeks in advance with a long list of dietary restrictions, seating preferences, and a surprise cake that needed to arrive at exactly the right moment. Normally, a reservation that size came with a full briefing, allergy notes passed along from the manager, a heads up about who needed the corner seat for a bad hip, a clear understanding of timing so the kitchen wouldn't get buried. Emma found out she'd been assigned the table only 20 minutes before the party arrived, and even then, only because she happened to check the reservation book herself.
"Wait, this is mine?"
she asked Priya, who was refilling salt shakers near the host stand without quite meeting Emma's eyes.
Nobody mentioned this to me all week. Guess it slipped through the cracks, Priya said, a little too smoothly.
Emma felt the familiar tightness settle into her shoulders, the sense that something had been arranged rather than accidental. She didn't have time to chase down explanations. The party was walking through the door in less than 15 minutes, and she had almost nothing to work with. No notes on allergies, no seating chart, no idea about the cake. She found the manager, Gary, in the back office and asked directly whether there were special instructions attached to the reservation. Gary blinked at her, clearly caught off guard.
"There should be a full sheet," he said, digging through a stack of papers before pulling out a crumpled printout that looked like it had been shoved into someone's apron pocket and forgotten. "This should have been on the table set up an hour ago." Emma didn't have time to figure out who'd buried it. She grabbed the sheet, scanned it fast. 3 severe nut allergies, 1 guest who needed a gluten-free menu, a request for the cake to come out after the main courses but before dessert menus were offered, and a seating request that put the guest of honor at the head of the table with a clear line of sight to the door. She had 12 minutes. Emma moved faster than she thought possible, resetting the table layout herself, flagging the kitchen about the allergies before a single plate could go out wrong, prepping a separate ticket system in her head to track which guests needed which modifications. When the party walked in, laughing, loud, already a little emotional about the retirement being celebrated, Emma greeted them like she'd been planning the event for weeks instead of minutes. The next 2 hours tested every skill she'd built over 3 years on the floor. She kept track of which guests couldn't have shellfish without needing to ask twice, coordinated with the kitchen to stagger courses so nothing came out cold, caught a mistake before a nut-based dressing accidentally landed on the wrong salad, and quietly signaled the kitchen the moment dessert timing approached so the cake would surprise the guest of honor exactly the way his family had planned. She didn't get everything perfect. 1 entree came out slightly late, and she smoothed it over with an easy apology and a round of drinks on the house, a call she made herself without waiting for Gary's approval. But by the time the party left, stuffed and satisfied, the guest of honor stopped by the host stand specifically to compliment her. "Best service we've had in years," he told Gary, loud enough for half the front of house to hear. "That young woman deserves a raise." Gary looked between Emma and the departing table, clearly impressed, clearly aware that something about the setup hadn't been right from the start. What Emma didn't know until later was that Nathan had been sitting in his usual spot near the window that entire evening, watching the whole thing unfold. He'd noticed the confusion when she'd first checked the reservation, noticed the missing information, noticed how quickly she'd pulled everything together without losing her composure once. He'd said nothing, ordered his usual meal, and watched her handle a room of 22 people like she'd been training for exactly this moment her whole career. When she finally stopped by his table near the end of her shift, exhausted but still upright, he didn't offer sympathy or make a comment about the obvious sabotage. "That was impressive," he said simply. "That was chaos," Emma corrected, dropping into the chair across from him for a rare 30-second break. "I had 12 minutes and half the information I needed." "And you still pulled it off without a single complaint," Nathan said. "That's not luck. That's the exact kind of composure I look for in a manager." Emma laughed, more from exhaustion than amusement, but something about the compliment landed harder than she expected. She thought about their conversation at the hotel days earlier, about opportunity and experience, and wondered if tonight had somehow been a test she hadn't known she was taking. Back near the kitchen, Priya and Jessica watched the interaction from a distance, their earlier confidence noticeably shaken. Whatever they'd hoped would happen by leaving Emma unprepared for a difficult table clearly hadn't gone according to plan. Instead of watching her fail, they'd watched her succeed in front of the one person whose opinion seemed to matter most in the restaurant that night. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Jessica muttered. "None of it was supposed to happen," Priya replied, and for the first time there was something uneasy in her voice instead of satisfaction. Neither of them said anything to Emma directly, but the tension between them had shifted into something new, something closer to worry than jealousy. They'd expected their plan to embarrass her once again.
Instead, they'd handed her the exact opportunity she needed to prove herself in front of Nathan, and neither of them had any idea how much closer that mistake had just brought the truth to the surface. The truth came out on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, during the slow stretch between lunch and dinner service, when most of the staff was restocking supplies or catching a late break. Emma was rolling silverware near the service station when she heard Marcus, a new busser who'd only been working there 3 weeks, ask a question that stopped everything. "Hey, is it true the whole thing with the Mafia guy started as a joke?" The break room went quiet. Emma looked up slowly, silverware still in her hands. Marcus, clearly not realizing he'd said anything wrong, kept talking, oblivious to the sudden tension in the room. "One of the line cooks told me Priya and Jessica set it up to embarrass her, sent her into that private room hoping the guy would be rude to her or something. Guess it kind of backfired." Emma set the fork down carefully, her hands steadier than she expected given how fast her heart was suddenly pounding. She'd suspected it, somewhere in the back of her mind, ever since that first strange night. The forced casualness in Priya's voice, the way Jessica had smirked before she'd even walked into the room, the total lack of information about who the VIP even was. But suspecting something and hearing it confirmed out loud by someone with no reason to lie felt entirely different. "Marcus," Priya said sharply, appearing in the doorway with Jessica right behind her. "That's not what happened." "That's exactly what happened," Emma said quietly, standing up. Her voice wasn't loud, but something in it carried through the room anyway. "You picked me because you thought a powerful, intimidating guy would make me feel small. You wanted a story to laugh about. That's what this was from the very beginning." Nobody denied it. Jessica's face had gone pale, and Priya opened her mouth like she might argue, then closed it again, apparently realizing there wasn't a version of this that made her sound less cruel. Word moved through the restaurant faster than any dinner rush ever had. By the time Gary called Emma into his office an hour later, he already knew most of it, pieced together from a nervous cook who'd overheard the original planning weeks earlier and finally decided the guilt wasn't worth carrying anymore. "I should have caught this," Gary said, running a hand over his face as Emma sat across from him. "The way people treated you around here, the comments, the exclusion. I told myself it was just personality clashes. I didn't want to see what was actually happening." "You're not the one who did it," Emma said, though she appreciated the honesty more than she let on. "I'm the one who was supposed to notice," Gary said. "That's on me too." He apologized properly, not the rushed, deflecting kind of apology Emma had half expected, but something that sounded like he meant it, an acknowledgement that the culture on the floor had let things slide for far too long. He told her Priya and Jessica would face consequences, though he didn't specify exactly what, and Emma didn't push for details. She wasn't interested in revenge. She was interested in finally understanding the full shape of what had happened to her. That evening, when Nathan came in for his usual dinner, Emma noticed something different in the way he looked at her. Careful, watchful, like he already knew what the day had held. "You heard," she said, sliding into the seat across from him during a lull. "I've known for a while," Nathan admitted. Emma blinked. "What?" "Not everything," he clarified, "but enough. That first night, the way the room felt staged, the way your coworkers acted when you got back, it wasn't hard to put together." He turned his glass slowly, his expression unreadable for a moment. "I could have said something, confronted them, made it disappear before it went any further." "Why didn't you?" Nathan looked at her directly, something steady and certain in his gaze. "Because I didn't want you to succeed because I intervened. I wanted you to prove yourself on your own, without anyone pulling strings behind the scenes. If I'd stepped in, none of what happened over these last few weeks would have meant as much. The way you handled that party last weekend, the way you talk about the restaurant you want to run someday, that all needed to come from you, not from me protecting you." Emma sat with that for a long moment, turning it over. Part of her wanted to be frustrated, wanted to point out that he could have spared her weeks of quiet humiliation and unwanted gossip. But underneath that frustration was something closer to respect. He hadn't used his influence to fix her problems. He'd let her build her own strength instead, trusting that she was capable of handling it, even when it would have been easier for him to simply make it disappear. "That's either the most respectful thing anyone's done for me," Emma said slowly, "or the most frustrating." "Probably both," Nathan said, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. Emma almost laughed, surprised at how much lighter she suddenly felt, like something that had been sitting heavy in her chest for weeks had finally loosened. The truth was out now, fully, without needing a dramatic confrontation or a scene that would have embarrassed everyone involved. Gary knew. The staff knew. And somehow, instead of feeling smaller because of it, Emma felt like she'd already outgrown the whole situation entirely. She thought about Priya and Jessica, not with anger exactly, but with something like pity. They'd spent weeks trying to engineer her humiliation, and instead they'd handed her the very thing they never expected her to find: real respect, real opportunity, and the beginning of a friendship built on something far sturdier than either of them could have predicted. What Emma didn't know yet was that Nathan had already been thinking about her future for longer than she realized, and the next opportunity headed her way wouldn't come from pity or convenience. It would come because he genuinely believed she was ready, even if the hardest part of proving it was still ahead of her. 3 weeks passed before Nathan brought it up, and when he finally did, it wasn't over dinner at the steakhouse the way Emma expected. He asked her to meet him at the Brooks Grand on a Sunday morning, her one full day off, and told her only that he had something to discuss. She found him in the same quiet corner of the hotel restaurant where they'd talked months earlier about her dreams of managing a restaurant someday. This time, he had a folder in front of him instead of a coffee cup. "We're opening a new restaurant inside the hotel," he said, sliding the folder across the table. "Fine dining, private events, the whole concept still being finalized. It opens in 4 months. Emma opened the folder, scanning through pages of preliminary plans, floor layouts, menu concepts, still in early stages. "This is beautiful," she said, genuinely impressed by the scope of it. "Why are you showing me this?" "There's a management trainee position," Nathan said. 6-month program, hands-on training across every part of the operation. Front of house, back of house, vendor relationships, staff scheduling, budgeting. Whoever gets it ends up running the floor once the restaurant opens. Emma felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her expression steady, unsure yet where this conversation was actually headed. "And you want me to interview for it?" "I want you to apply for it," Nathan corrected. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "The difference is I'm not offering you the job," Nathan said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I'm telling you it exists, and I'm telling you that you'd be a strong candidate, but the hiring panel doesn't know you, doesn't know me, doesn't know anything about the last few months. You'll go through the same process as every other applicant, same interviews, same evaluations, same standards." Emma sat back slightly, processing what he was actually offering, which was far less than she'd braced herself for, and somehow far more meaningful because of it. She'd half expected him to hand her the position outright, a quiet reward for everything she'd endured, and part of her, the tired, exhausted part that had spent 3 years being overlooked, would have taken it without complaint. But another part of her, the part that had spent months proving to herself that she was capable of more, felt something settle into place at his words. "You're not going to put in a good word for me," she said slowly. "Not even a little." "Not one word," Nathan confirmed. "If you get this, I want it to be because you earned it completely. Otherwise, you'll always wonder, and so will everyone who eventually works under you." It wasn't the answer she wanted in the moment, but it was, she realized, exactly the answer she needed. She thought about Gary's restaurant, about the months of proving herself on a floor that hadn't always been fair to her, about the retirement party she'd salvaged with 12 minutes and half the information she needed. She'd built her instincts the hard way, and she wasn't interested in a shortcut that would make all of it feel smaller. "Okay," she said. "I'll apply." The next 3 weeks became some of the most demanding of Emma's life. She picked up every management book she could find, studied cost control and inventory systems on her lunch breaks, asked Gary if she could shadow him during scheduling meetings, even though she wasn't technically required to. She stayed late some nights, just to watch how he handled vendor calls, taking notes on things she'd never had reason to learn as a server. The interview process for the trainee position turned out to be more rigorous than she expected. The first round was a panel of 3 people, none of whom Emma recognized, none of whom seemed to have any connection to Nathan beyond working for his company. They asked detailed questions about conflict resolution, about handling difficult staff members, about balancing customer satisfaction against operational costs.
Emma answered with real examples pulled from years on the floor. The retirement party disaster she'd fixed in 12 minutes, a time she'd had to defuse an argument between 2 line cooks before it affected service, the systems she'd have built if she'd been allowed to fix the scheduling chaos at her current job. The second round involved a practical exercise, a mock scenario where she had to design a service plan for a hypothetical private event with limited information, eerily similar to the exact situation her co-workers had once tried to sabotage her with. This time, though, she wasn't scrambling. She walked the panel through her thinking calmly, explaining how she'd prioritize allergy information, how she'd structure staff assignments, how she'd handle a last-minute change without letting it derail the entire event. By the third round, Emma could tell the questions had shifted from testing her knowledge to genuinely trying to understand how she thought, how she led, what kind of manager she'd actually become once given real authority. She left that final interview feeling like she'd given everything she had, with no way of knowing whether it had been enough. The call came 4 days later. Emma was folding napkins in the break room when her phone rang, an unfamiliar number she almost let go to voicemail. The woman on the other end introduced herself as the hiring coordinator for Brooks Hospitality Group and told her, in a straightforward professional tone, that she'd been selected for the management trainee position. Emma had to sit down. She thanked the coordinator, hung up, and sat there for a long moment in stunned silence, staring at the stack of half-folded napkins in front of her. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a favor. It was the first thing in years she'd earned entirely through her own effort, built on months of proving herself in rooms that hadn't always been kind to her. When she called Nathan to tell him, he sounded genuinely pleased, though not surprised. "I never doubted it," he said simply. "You didn't even ask how the interviews went," Emma pointed out. "I didn't need to," Nathan said. "I already knew what you were capable of. I just needed you to see it too." Emma hung up the phone that evening with something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not relief, not gratitude exactly, but something steadier. Confidence. The kind that didn't depend on anyone else's opinion of her, built entirely on her own 2 feet. Emma's first week as a management trainee felt nothing like she'd imagined. She'd pictured herself easing into the role, shadowing someone experienced, learning slowly before taking on real responsibility. Instead, she was handed a stack of vendor contracts on day 2 and told to review them before the afternoon meeting, expected to keep up, even though half the terminology was unfamiliar. The restaurant, which the team had started calling Cassia after months of debate over names, wasn't set to open for another 3.5 months, which meant Emma's early weeks were consumed by decisions most guests would never think twice about. She sat through meetings about linen suppliers and dishwashing equipment, helped interview line cooks even though she'd never hired anyone in her life, learned how to read a profit and loss statement from a finance director who spoke almost entirely in acronyms. She made mistakes. In her second week, she approved an order for napkins in the wrong color, a small error that nonetheless meant a rush reorder and an uncomfortable conversation with the head of purchasing. In her third week, she scheduled 2 key staff members for the same interview slot, forcing an awkward reshuffle that made her look disorganized in front of people she was supposed to be managing eventually. Diane, the general manager Emma had met on her first visit to the hotel, became something between a mentor and a reality check. She didn't sugarcoat feedback, and she didn't let Emma's mistakes slide just because Nathan had personally shown her the position existed. "You're going to mess things up," Diane told her bluntly after the scheduling error. "Everyone does. What matters is how fast you catch it and fix it before it becomes someone else's problem. Emma took the criticism the way she'd learned to take everything over the past few months, without flinching, without making excuses, just absorbing it and adjusting. She started double-checking her own work obsessively, building simple systems to track details she used to trust to memory.
Slowly, the mistakes became less frequent, replaced by the kind of quiet competence that didn't announce itself, but showed up in the details nobody noticed until they were handled correctly.
Nathan checked in occasionally, though far less than Emma expected, given how personally invested he'd seemed in her getting the position at all. He'd stop by during the construction phase, ask Diane how the trainee program was going, sometimes catch Emma in the hallway for a brief conversation about how she was adjusting. He never sat in on her meetings, never reviewed her decisions before they went to the wider team, never made it obvious to anyone else in the building that he had any particular interest in how she was doing.
"Aren't you supposed to be checking my work?"
Emma asked him once, half joking, during one of his rare visits.
"Diane's checking your work," Nathan said. "That's her job. My job is running the company, not micromanaging one trainee, even one I happen to think is doing well."
"You think I'm doing well?"
"I think you're doing exactly what I expected," Nathan said, "which is better than well." It wasn't effusive praise, but Emma had learned enough about Nathan by then to understand that his restraint meant something. He didn't hand out compliments freely, which made the ones he gave feel earned rather than empty. As the opening date approached, the pace of Emma's work intensified. She helped finalize the training program for new servers, borrowing heavily from her own years of experience, the things she'd wished someone had taught her when she started waiting tables at 19. She sat in on menu tastings, offering opinions on plating and pacing that the executive chef, initially skeptical of a trainee's input, eventually started actively seeking out. The hardest part wasn't the workload. It was learning to lead people who were sometimes older, sometimes more experienced on paper, and occasionally resistant to taking direction from someone still technically in training. One server, a woman named Renata with over a decade of fine dining experience, made it clear in her first few shifts that she didn't think much of Emma's authority. "I've worked in restaurants longer than you've probably been serving," Renata said flatly, after Emma corrected her table-setting technique during a practice run. Emma didn't back down, but she didn't escalate either. "You're right that you have more experience than me in a lot of ways," she said evenly. "But this restaurant runs a specific system, and everyone needs to be consistent, including me. If you think there's a better way to do it, I'm happy to hear it after service, not during." It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no ultimatums, just a calm, clear boundary that Emma held without apologizing for it. Renata seemed surprised, maybe even a little impressed, and their working relationship improved steadily after that, built on mutual respect rather than forced deference. By the final month before opening, Emma had settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time, entirely her own. She wasn't performing competence the way she had in her early weeks, anxious about proving herself. She simply was competent. The kind of quiet confidence that came from having made mistakes, survived them, and learned something real each time. Nathan's visits remained infrequent, but Emma noticed something had changed in the way people around the hotel treated her. Diane started introducing her to vendors as the future manager of Cassia, not the trainee. The kitchen staff began routing questions directly to her instead of waiting for Diane's approval first. Even Renata, in her own gruff way, had started deferring to Emma's judgment on floor decisions without being asked. The friendship between Emma and Nathan continued quietly through all of it, dinners occasionally, brief conversations during his visits, an easy familiarity that had grown steadily without either of them forcing it into something more dramatic. There was no grand romantic gesture, no sudden declaration, just two people who'd built something real out of honesty and respect, watching each other's lives unfold with genuine investment without needing to define exactly what that meant yet. 2 weeks before Cassia's opening night, Emma stood in the empty dining room after a long day of final preparations, looking out at tables that would soon be filled with guests she'd worked months to prepare for.
She thought about the woman who'd nervously walked into that private dining room all those months ago, certain she was about to be humiliated, and felt an almost unrecognizable distance between that version of herself and the one standing here now. She'd built this.
Every difficult conversation, every late-night studying operations, every mistake she'd owned and corrected, all of it belonged to her completely. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. Not because someone had handed her the opportunity, but because she'd finally proven to herself that she deserved it. Cassia had been open for 4 months when it hosted its busiest weekend yet. A Saturday night booked solid from 5 o'clock straight through closing. Every table filled, a wait list stretching past the bar. Emma stood near the host stand at 7:30, watching the dining room move with the kind of controlled energy she'd spent the better part of a year learning to build from scratch. The night hadn't started easily. 2 servers called in sick within an hour of each other, forcing Emma to rework the floor plan on the fly, pulling a trainee up from part-time hours and taking a section herself for the first hour just to keep service moving. The kitchen ran into a delivery delay on one of the evening's featured dishes, which meant Emma had to walk the floor personally, explaining the substitution to guests with the same calm reassurance she used to give at the steakhouse years ago. None of it rattled her the way it might have once. She'd learned, over the months, that a smooth night wasn't the absence of problems. It was simply handling them before anyone noticed there'd been a problem at all. By 9 o'clock, the dining room had settled into its rhythm. Every table served, every complaint resolved. The kitchen finally caught up after the early scramble. Diane found her near the service station, arms crossed, watching the floor with an expression Emma had come to recognize as quiet approval. "You didn't need me tonight," Diane said. "Not once." "I definitely needed you an hour ago," Emma said, laughing despite the exhaustion in her voice. "You needed someone to bounce ideas off," Diane corrected. "That's different from needing someone to fix it for you. You fixed it. I just stood here." Emma didn't have time to respond before the hostess waved her toward the entrance, letting her know a walk-in wanted to speak with the manager. Emma smoothed her blazer and headed toward the front, expecting a complaint about the wait time, already running through the usual script in her head. Instead, she found Nathan standing near the host stand, dressed in the same tailored dark suit she remembered from that very first night, though something about the way he stood here now felt entirely different from that tense evening in the private dining room all those months ago. "You didn't make a reservation," Emma said, unable to keep the smile off her face. "I wanted to see how you'd handle a walk-in on your busiest night," Nathan said, glancing around the packed dining room. "Looks like you managed fine without me interfering." She led him to a small table near the window, the same kind of quiet gesture she remembered from her days serving him at the steakhouse, except now she wasn't nervously taking his order. She was simply his host, in a restaurant she'd helped build from empty blueprints into a fully running operation. "How does it feel?" Nathan asked, once he'd settled into his seat and she'd sat across from him for the first real break she'd taken all night. Emma looked out over the dining room, at servers moving efficiently between tables, at guests leaning into conversations over plates of food she'd helped design the pacing for, at Renata expertly managing a difficult table with the same calm authority Emma had once had to fight to earn her respect. Everything in the room existed because of decisions Emma had made, mistakes she'd corrected, systems she'd built through trial and error over months of relentless effort. "It feels like mine," she said finally. "All of it." Nathan nodded slowly, something steady and proud in his expression, though he didn't say anything grand about it. He never had, not once throughout the entire process, and Emma had come to understand that his restraint had always been intentional. He'd wanted her to build this without leaning on him, and now that it was built, he wasn't going to diminish it by claiming any part of the credit. "I'm not here as your boss tonight," he said, "or whatever it is people think I am to you. I'm just a customer, watching someone who earned every bit of this." Emma thought back to that first night, walking nervously into a private dining room, certain she was about to be humiliated in front of strangers, set up by coworkers who wanted nothing more than to watch her fail. She thought about the rumors that followed, the whispered speculation,
the sabotaged reservation that had somehow become the moment that proved her capable of far more than anyone around her had believed. She thought about the interviews she'd fought for on her own merit, the mistakes she'd owned without excuses, the quiet confidence she'd built one difficult shift at a time. None of it had happened the way anyone intended. Priya and Jessica had wanted a story to laugh about at her expense. Instead, they'd accidentally introduced her to the one person who'd looked past every assumption people made about her and simply seen someone worth respecting. Nathan had never tried to rescue her from her circumstances. He'd simply refused to look away when everyone else had decided she wasn't worth their attention. And that quiet act of respect had ended up changing the entire direction of her life.
"You know," Emma said, watching the dining room fill with warm conversation and the comfortable clatter of a restaurant running exactly as it should. "If Priya and Jessica hadn't set up that whole thing, none of this would exist. This restaurant, this job, any of it."
"They didn't give you any of this," Nathan said. "You did. They just happened to be standing there when it started." Emma considered that, turning it over the way she'd learned to turn over most things Nathan said, carefully, without rushing to agree or disagree. He was right, in the way he usually was. The cruelty of that original prank hadn't handed her anything. It had simply placed her, unknowingly, in front of an opportunity she'd spent every day since proving she deserved. Later that night, after the last table had been cleared and the final numbers tallied, Emma stood alone in the quiet dining room. The lights dimmed low, the day's chaos finally settled into stillness. She thought about the frightened waitress who'd walked into a private room months ago, certain her co-worker's plan would end in humiliation, and felt an almost unrecognizable distance between that version of herself and the woman standing here now, running a restaurant she'd built with her own hands. What had started as an attempt to embarrass her had somehow become the turning point of her entire life. Not because someone had rescued her, but because one person had refused to treat her as anything less than capable from the very first moment they met. Respect, she realized, standing in the quiet glow of the restaurant she now called hers, had a way of rewriting everything it touched, turning cruelty into opportunity, and turning a frightened waitress into exactly the woman she'd always had the potential to become.